In the monastic life, this is one of the main days of the year. I was for many years a Carthusian and now I'm living as a hermit, but in the Carthusian life, the Feast of St. John the Baptist was one of the 4 days in the year when we were allowed to speak to the brothers, and it was something therefore which put us in the army of those who, right through the centuries, looked to St. John the Baptist as the first Christian monk, sort of. And that's what I want to land you tonight, because we're sharing this in the desert of a faithful community, in this place which is, in a sense, precisely in that desert which doesn't change, and which we need, because no priest can be such without also being, by vocation and orientation, a contemplative. It has no sense. It's about relationship. And if that is not there, we're functioning as machines. We're administrating. And that is the point at which the devil can, bit by bit, weaken the interior life of the priest so that eventually he hasn't the means to resist when there's a strong pull or discouragement or whatever it might be. It might actually be an attack, because unfortunately he can use people to discourage even a good priest, especially a good priest actually. He might feel very isolated. Now, we must realize therefore that this hand-to-hand combat which characterizes the whole monastic world, it was regarded as the front line of the battle in a way, because they were going out to the desert to fight where the demons had been thrown out from the cities where grace had come. But it's there now again, and we have to be aware that the priesthood is that frontline battle. We are saving souls, and we're handling, therefore, cosmic issues every time. It's not just social behavior, it's the salvation every time of an immortal soul. And the devil knows it. And we have to take that very seriously. Every time a soul is in front of us, an eternity is in front of us. So we have to have that interior life and that whole perception of what the Holy Spirit is nudging us to say at the right time, or putting us in a place at the right time. Things happen, but the Lord is putting us there. So we have to have that openness to all the surprises of God, a great elasticity. We can't program time. We have to be available. But this element of also entering into a mode of relationship, and therefore of needing that isolation from complication to which I alluded this earlier, is fundamental also to our very existence as priests. Now, inbuilt in our life is, if obedient, an automatic element of desert, several times a day. It's back to base, back to base, back to base. In French, after the council, the abbreviated they had, the intermediate, the interim version, was called Prière du temps présent. And it's a good word. Prayer of the present, time. Sanctifying time. Sanctifying this keep time, which sanctifies all the time in between, but it's calling us back to base. And this is our safeguard. If we come back to that desert of separation, and I mean separation that we're not available at that point, it's not just sitting back and opening a book, it's an ecclesial act, then we are able to be worked upon by the one that we're working for. We are experiencing in our day something of the bell of the monastic life. We're coming back, ressourcer, to resource our souls. In the monastery, I think it was our own, it might have been the Grand Chartreuse, but there was on the bell, Vox Delecti, the voice of the beloved. And when the bell was ringing, that was it. Come back to me, you're here for me. There's no bell for us, although actually in Ireland they still have the Angelus even on the television and the radio. And so one hears it. But the bell is the interior clockwork. It's time to come back to base. In the year of the Eucharist, some years ago, under John Paul II, there was a plenary indulgence, I think, if one recited Vespers and Compline in front of the Blessed Sacrament. It was a hint, it was a carrot for us priests. Because if we do some of the office in front of the Blessed Sacrament, we're isolated, and also we're in some way representing the whole church before the tabernacle. In the Carthusian life, the sacristan did that quite a few times. He was able to represent the community alone. He was the only one who could go in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Now, this element of, therefore, being aware that when we take this up, we are, as it were, a little bit in the same mode as it would be at the altar. It's liturgy, the work of God, Opus Dei, liturgia, the work of the people of God. And therefore, that demands a certain consequence as regards behavior, interiority, and, of course, separation from interruptions. Now, the advantage of living in the period in which we are living is that that can be done with greater interiority and intensity of dialogue than before. Because before, it was, although it could be also that, but it was tendentially an element of obligation and a quantity affair. There was a lot, it was heavy, because the priests had the same quantity as the monks in practice. So, therefore, they went quite quickly, and they put it in blocks. Now, the whole thrust of the renewal was to go into the veritas horarum, the truth of the hours, and reduce quite a lot the quantity, but to aerate it with pauses and dialogue, therefore, that the words sink in. Now, it's one thing to get through the quantity, it's another to breathe between the sounds. I remember at Corley Island in Wales, it's the only monastery in Wales, it's a Trappist monastery on an island. They, very early on in the renewal, had gone into what they still have, a long pause between each sound. And it was therefore breathing in. And that made a difference. But potentially the hint is there also for anyone who prays the divine office. Make it breathe and vibrate. And therefore the need for an echo comes in. The word has need of silence for its echo to come back. And the reading, the short reading at the other hours, but the long readings at the office of readings, the old vigils, they are very rich. And by the very fact of having on a daily basis these rich readings, we are nourished. So let the church minister to us. Breathe the whole prayer of the church. The whole church is praying those words. It's very powerful. And then, of course, according to one's own modalities, but it can be sung, or bits of it can be sung. It can be celebrated with the people. And some people appreciate it a lot. And actually, quite often, if one is, for instance, with a pious person at a certain moment, and it's time for the office, one can quite easily invite that person, shall we celebrate this office together? And it works perfectly well. They are honoured. It's fellowship. It's putting the brakes on, it's bringing it back to God. It works perfectly well. And quite often I find that with people I'm in company where there will be pious people who would also be able to sing. And it's quite easy to sing parts or all of the office. That makes it somewhat of a celebration, which puts it then in that ambience of the work of God truly, when God is honoured by that element of the whole person coming into mode. And of course, as you're aware, in the monastic ethos, the whole person does enter into mode. There is a whole celebratory act in which we honour God by all He's given us, the body, Gloria Patri and so on, the gestuality, things done properly. Our Lady at Lourdes taught little Bernadette to make the sign of the cross. She didn't want this, and her hand would not go. Our Lady, as it were, miraculously showed her how to do it, and only then was she able to make the sign of the cross. Un bel signe de la croix, a big, nice, dignified sign of the cross. And so it should be. Everything done for God, properly. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And that, of course, is the advantage of the renewal in general. We're doing essentially what the Church has always done, but trying, by the diminution of number in all gestures and words, doing it well and with interiority. Once and felt. Once only, but thought and meant. And that's a grace to be perceived. Now, therefore, with regard to this, we then avoid that great illness which is in the present priestly life, which was referred to by Benedict XVI as the illness of activism. And he said in a very powerful teaching he gave, I think it must have been one of his catechetical talks on a Wednesday, he said this modern illness of activism leads to hardening of the heart, duritia cordis. And I'm not sure now, but before, a rescript coming from the Vatican, when a priest was being laicized and he was leaving the priesthood, it ended up with this last word, as it were, a reminder, in case there was something still there. Ad duritiam cordis, for the hardness of his heart. And that was sometimes something which might pull yet a cord before that last departure. Now, Benedict XVI was talking about that. This hardening of the heart, that we no longer respond to grace. We're doing it ourselves. We're very efficient, we're great managers, we're great administrators, but there's no relationship. Relationship, therefore, is this element of loving and listening to the gentle voice of the beloved, who's very, very quiet and discreet, but he's trying to get through. And more than we think. Because the priesthood, in virtue of the fact that we're doing what depends on us, as the voices of God on earth, to do what He is bound to be doing through us and only through us at that point. Therefore, He has a word for us. We have somebody, a congregation or an individual in confession, in front of us, put there by divine providence, put in our hands to be saved, healed, directed, enlightened, consoled. And we must know what to say, but He knows better than we. He knows the needs of each one there. And they are sometimes being moved far more than we can think by a word which is unaware to us, coming from the Holy Spirit. If all the time we're listening for a prompting, a nudge. It's happening all the time in the priesthood if we only listened and sharpened the antennae of our soul. So anytime we start to celebrate a sacrament, or preach, or talk to a class, or even write an article, the first instinct must be, let it be your word, give me a word. But it's important also, even in a dialogue, non-sacramental, because also that is sacramental in the sense that we are talking in His name. And a word there over a cup of coffee can orientate a person in a big way sometimes. But having said that, it also is something of what is going on in our listening to Him when we're in front of a soul. And indeed of souls, the collective, we're listening to them. Now, both in conversation, essentially we start by picking up, so we're not talking in the air. But also when we are in front of people, it's important to look at them. Suicide, as regard priestly ministry, especially preaching, is to have between you and your people a page. Just look at them and relate to them, and you can see straight away when they're not following you. Many preachers, unfortunately, are not distinguishing between a lecture and a contact. There's a huge difference. Might be perfect intellectually and theologically, but they're not touched. A few words said to the heart, eyeball to eyeball, meant and kept alive, will remain in their mind. And the Lord gave the model, the parable. It doesn't have to be long, it has to be memorable. I find that it's very important in every sermon, but partly because I've always got so many children there, but it works also for adults. There should be something visual every time. At least a story or something which has happened or something, but also, if possible, some visual aid. We were taught that in Rome. It was something which people remembered. I'll just give you an example of the kind of thing that our lecturer in Rome was mentioning with regard to the importance of that kind of thing. One day, he was Dominican, had used his weekly allowance, pocket money, to buy a vase, a precious vase, crystal. And he went into the pulpit in front of a big church that Sunday with this precious vase. And he started preaching to these respectable ladies and all. This is your immortal soul. And it's dangling over the doors of hell. And it just takes one small moment of weakness and lack of concentration, and I lost it. What a waste! Yes, dear, that was a waste of all eternity. And that, of course, was a sermon that no one would forget, more in that congregation. He might have read a perfect dialogue, but if it wasn't something which they remembered, it has no effect. But mutatis mutandis, the challenge is there each time. Let there be something that they will never forget. Because the important ones, remember, in there often are the younger ones. The younger ones. They need something that will work upon them against all the barrage of distraction and competition that they've got elsewhere. Remember, they have little concentration. They're too bombarded. So we have to find something that will keep their attention. Don't be long, but get there. Now, I just want to conclude with this where I started. It's precisely the element of listening on all levels, because that comes from knowing what actually does get to a person. We must never be boring, whether it's in individual conversation, always be relating to, but with that same relation which comes from God and to God. In other words, an element of that element, if you like, of contemplation and adoration and awaiting, which we have when we're, for instance, before the Blessed Sacrament, waiting for someone greater to come in, also extends to those that His providence sends us. That we have that respect, waiting, receptivity to also the person who comes to us. One does not talk at. One first wants to learn, and therefore one has to be empty and listening. It's a whole art. And then, having listened patiently, one will address the real problem, the real issue. It's important.